Welcome to the last discussion video for Module 5.2. This will be the last discussion video for the course Accounting for uh, Government and Nonprofit Organizations. So let us illustrate what we have learned under the concepts of under the concepts introduced in Module 5.1, yung nonprofit organizations. So under this discussion, we will itemize yung unrestricted, temporarily restricted, and then restricted funds used in the three nonprofit organizations given focus on this module, which are the schools, colleges, and universities, the hospitals, and the voluntary health and welfare organizations. So for this part, the unrestricted fund includes all the assets of a nonprofit organization that are available for use as authorized by the board and is not restricted for specific purposes. So we discussed na natin yan earlier. So let us look at how revenues and gains from unrestricted fund are treated under the institutions. The revenues and gains of unrestricted fund are derived from a number of sources. For example, a hospital derives unrestricted fund revenues from patient services, unrestricted donations, and unrestricted income from endowment fund. So we already have characterized what an endowment fund is at kung ano-ano yung classification ng endowment fund. College and university sources of unrestricted fund naman include student tuition fees, government grants, donation and private grants, and unrestricted income from endowment fund. So revenues of unrestricted fund may also include membership dues, interest, dividends, and gains from investments in debt and equity securities. So let us take a look. The revenues from the services. And non-profit organizations' total revenues are reported in the period in which services are rendered, even though part or all of the revenue is to be waived or reduced. So nire-recognize natin yung revenue na yun kung saan siya ang period na render. To illustrate, assume that the following non-profit organization service records for May include the following data. So let us take a look for a hospital operations. So given the gross patient service, this is a revenue account. Meron siyang note before charity care or contractual adjustments. So remember the discussion on the gross patient service revenue. Sinasabi doon that the charity care should be excluded from the gross patient service revenue. So yung gross patient service revenue is 200,000. So yung tinutukoy na before charity care na nandito is this. The charity care for poor and indigent persons patients is 10,000. So ang when we look at charity care or charity services, these are free of charge. So, ibig sabihin, libre yan for indigent persons, for poor, pwedeng for senior citizens. It depends on the problem. But when we look at this, yung charity care na tinutukoy dyan, it should be deducted on the gross patient service revenue. Kaya, dapat yung 200,000 minus 10,000, yun lang ang i-record natin na revenue. Next, the contractual adjustment allowed to Medicare patients, 30,000. So, itong Medicare patients na to, parang PhilHealth, ganun. Which is a contract between the non-profit hospital and the third party, which is Medicare. So, sila yung mag-uusap dyan dahil walang babayaran yung patient. So, later, let's look at how it is journalized. Next, the provision for doubtful accounts. So, may possibility na hindi makollect na 20,000. So, the following journal entries are recorded in the unrestricted fund of the hospital. Okay, we debit under the gross patient service revenue. We already have computed this. You debit accounts receivable. Yung matatanggap mo na lang is 190,000. And then credit the service revenue from patients, 190,000. This is exclusive of the charity care for poor and indigent persons na 10,000. Next. So, ibig sabihin, itong 190,000 na to, since this is a service revenue from patients, ito yung babayaran ng patient sa hospital. So, ang yung charity care na ibinawas sa kanya na 10,000 has already been deducted in the recognition. How about the contractual adjustment na allowed to Medicare patients? So, dahil may contractual adjustments, ibig sabihin si Medicare ang magbabayad kay hospital nung amount na 30,000. So, you have to reduce your receivable from patients. So, debit contractual adjustments 30,000 and then credit accounts receivable 30,000. This is to record the contractual adjustments allowed to Medicare. So later on, yung contractual adjustments will be closed when Medicare send the the funds related to this transaction. The next, the recognition of the doubtful accounts, debit doubtful accounts, credit allowance for doubtful accounts, 20,000. So that's how the hospital operations work when we look at patient services. Let's take a look at colleges and universities. So the items are gross tuition fees, 500,000. The tuition waivers provided under fellowship program, 50,000. These tuition waivers are like yung charity services. Parang charity services yan. Yung charity care for poor and indigent persons, ito rin yun. Kumbaga, these are deductions on the gross tuition fees. Next, the provision for doubtful accounts na 25,000. How do we journalize this? We debit accounts receivable 500,000, credit service revenue from tuition fees 500,000. And then, how do we recognize the tuition waivers under this fellowship program? We eliminate, or we do not eliminate, but we reduce our receivable kasi yung receivable na yun matatanggap mo uh, from the students because of the payment of the tuition fees. So, you debit expenditures for student aid 50,000 and then credit accounts receivable para bawasan ng 50,000 yung accounts receivable na sinet up mo dito kanina. Then, the provision of the doubtful accounts and allowance for doubtful accounts 25,000. Okay. Let us take a look at the discussion here. The contractual adjustments recorded illustrate the unique feature of non-profit hospitals because only uh, this account is used in non-profit hospitals. Usually kasi, the concept on hospitals is accounts receivable are collectible from a third-party payer. So, rather than from the patient. Among the third-party payers are the Philippine Health or the Philippine Health Insurance Corporation, the Medicare, and the private medical insurance companies. For colleges and universities naman, the comparable tuition adjustment is debited to expenditures student aid account. So, anong sinasabi lang dito? When we most of the non-profit hospitals that we have are majority of the transactions are between a third-party payer or normally PhilHealth, Medicare ang nagbabayad. Yung mga patient ay normally konti na lang yung binabayaran niyan. Kaya the use of the contractual adjustments has been a unique feature for non-profit hospitals because ginagamit itong account na ito to recognize kung magkano yung receivable natin from the third party. In effect, in for colleges and universities, we then use the account expenditures and student aid to reflect the receivable naman from mga institutions na magbabayad sa iyo. Kumbaga, itong contractual adjustments and expenditures is student aid are essentially of the same substance. Okay, in the statement of activities o yung income statement under the non-profit organizations, the balances of the contractual adjustments account for hospital and the expenditures for student aid account for colleges are to be deducted from the total service revenues to compute the net service revenue for the month. The allowance for ADA or the balance of allowance for ADA is treated in the usual manner, that is a deduction from the AR in the balance sheet. Write-offs of AR, if any, are also recorded in the customary manner. So same procedure when we look at ADA. Yung contractual adjustments and expenditures for student aid account are deducted from the total service revenue. So how about kung merong mga contributions like services, facilities, or materials, how do we recognize it? So kung merong mga ganung klaseng contributions from various individuals or parties, how do you recognize it? You debit inventories if it is an inventory, and then credit contributions revenue. It is recorded at the fair market value. The contributed material is recorded in the inventor's account at its current fair value with the corresponding credit to the revenue account in an unrestricted fund as shown in the entry. Okay, if services naman ang kinontributes, how do you recognize it? You just have to debit salaries expense. Kung contributed facilities naman, pwede yung rent expense. Then, credit mo sa contributions revenue. Okay, kaya siya rent expense because you contributed a facility for use for a particular period. Hindi mo siya you contribute the building. Kasi kung building na yung kinontribute, you have to recognize yung debit building and then credit contribution revenue. In this case, the tenor of the statement is a facility which will be used for a particular period of time. Okay, next. Uh, the other operating revenues which kanina ay napasadahan na ito, we already introduced this before. These represent income derived from other related activities other than the service revenues of non-profit organizations. What are the examples? The proceeds from gift shops. If there are gift shops along the hospitals or the universities, there are cafeterias, snack bars, news stands, and parking lots. Since these do not form part of the general revenue, uh, uh, the general placement of the funds where we accumulate the revenues, we have to separate it under the other operating revenues account title because uh, these are not primary to the operations of the non-profit organizations because these are only miscellaneous and these are additional. So how do we recognize it? We debit cash if it is cash or accounts receivable, and then you credit other operating revenue. Next, the pledges. So what is a pledge? We already have introduced it before. It is a promise to give. It is a commitment by a prospective donor. A prospective donor, it means that the donor does not give the item or the amount of cash to the non-profit organization, but it is scheduled on a future date or maybe in installments. So how do you recognize this? Under the accrual basis of accounting, unconditional pledges are recorded as receivables and revenues in the unrestricted fund with appropriate provision for doubtful pledges. Pledges due in future accounting periods or having restrictions as to their use are accounted for in a restricted fund if there are restrictions. So we have to look at how it is pledged because uh, if it is a pledge in a future period or it has restrictions, it is accounted under restricted fund. But if it is unconditional or there's no provision on the or any condition before the pledge will be given, it is recorded under the unrestricted fund. So please take note of this. Pag unconditional pledge, unrestricted fund yon. Pero kung pledge siya in a future period, future accounting period pa, or merong mga restrictions na inimpose on that item, ay i-classify under the restricted fund. Okay, let us illustrate this. To illustrate the accounting for pledges, assume the non-profit organization receive unconditional pledges. So when we say unconditional pledges, it is recorded under the unrestricted fund. Totaling 500,000 in fundraising drive, 10% of the pledges are considered to be doubtful. The required journal entries are shown below. So when they pledge 500,000, di ba sabi kanina, you recognize the pledge as it is because i-recognize mo na agad as pledge receivable 500,000, then credit 500,000 contributions revenue para kapag na-receive na yung collection ay accounted kung sino yung mga nag-pledge. Then, the setting up of the provision for doubtful pledges. Debit doubtful pledges expenses 50,000. The allowance for doubtful pledges is 50,000. Kasi there is a possibility uh, of an unrealized pledge. Contributions revenue and other operating revenues are presented in the statement of activities as well as doubtful accounts. Accounts receivable are presented in the balance sheet net of the allowance for doubtful accounts. Okay. Okay, let's take a look at the expenses of the unrestricted fund. So under the expenses under the unrestricted fund, we have yung concept of the program services and the supporting services. So the program services, this means these are the primary services by the organization. However, yung support services, this includes yung mga administrative and fundraising costs which supports the program services. So, ganun lang siya. Okay, let's take a look. The depreciation expense is required on all the property and equipment of non-profit organizations except for individual works of art or historical treasures having extraordinary long economic lives. So, essentially the same ang recognition ng depreciation expense. Okay, how do we recognize the assets and liabilities of an unrestricted fund? Most of the assets and liabilities of non-profit organizations' unrestricted fund are similar to the current assets and liabilities of a business or enterprise, so they are essentially the same. Cash, investment accounts, receivable, inventories, and prepaid expenses are typical assets of an unrestricted fund. Non-profit organizations that use fund accounting generally account for fixed assets in a property and equipment fund. So, yung fixed assets normally na-account sa property and equipment fund kapag NPO ka. The liabilities of an unrestricted fund include payables, accrued expenses, deferred revenues, similar to those of a business enterprise. So they are essentially the same, only the use of some fund items like the property and equipment fund. Okay, let's take a look at restricted fund. The non-profit organization established restricted fund to account for assets received from donors. These assets are available for current use but expendable only as authorized by the donor of the assets. So kung ano lang yung purpose nung fund na yon or nung item na ibinigay, doon lang pwedeng gamitin under the concept of a restricted fund. The assets of restricted funds are not derived from the operations of the non-profit organization. Instead, the assets are obtained from restricted gifts or grants from individuals or entities, governmental entities, revenues from restricted fund investments, realized and unrealized gains or investments of the restricted funds, and restricted income from endowment funds. So, the assets of the restricted fund, hindi yan galing sa operations ng non-profit. Dahil kung galing yan sa operations ng non-profit, normally yan ay unrestricted fund. So, yan ay galing sa mga donations ng iba't ibang individuals or governmental entities. So, yun lang ang ibig niyang sabihin on that passage. The restricted funds are classified into temporary and permanently. This has been discussed earlier, but let us take a look at how it is identified in detail. When you look at temporarily restricted funds, they are a specific purpose. They are time restricted and they are planned replacement and expansion funds. So kung hindi yan yung classification before it can be yan yung criteria before it can be classified as a temporarily restricted fund. However, when you said it is permanently restricted, these are assets that are to be held for an indefinite period of time and generally are included in an endowment fund. So ito yung mini-mention ko kanina na there is the term indefinite when we look at the permanent restrictions on the funds. When it is a specific purpose, if the purpose has been has if the purpose is achieved or the condition has been achieved, if the time has lapsed or the time being has been met, the temporarily restricted funds will be transferred to the unrestricted funds. However, under the permanently restricted funds, it is not transferred because of the indefinite period of time na ang funds na yan will be restricted. Excuse me. So let us illustrate. Okay, assume that the non-profit organization received the following donations on June 1, 2011. So we have a cash restricted for the acquisition of equipment for a special project, 50,000. Securities at market value for permanently endowment for permanent endowment of a special project. Any income earned on the securities is restricted to use for the special project. So kung ano man yung kitain on that endowment fund ay gagamitin lang din on the special project. So, very restricted yan. On July 1, the non-profit paid 20,000 for the equipment received and receive dividend income from the securities amounting to 4,500. These transactions and events are recorded by the non-profit organization as shown on the next page. Okay, let us take a look. So, under the restricted fund, let us take a look. Yung cash natin, restricted. Naka-receive ka daw ng cash. Restricted for the acquisition of equipment for special project. How do you recognize it? You debit cash, 50,000. Then you credit contribution revenue, temporarily restricted, 50,000. How do you recognize that it is temporarily restricted? Because it is a plant replacement and expansion fund for the acquisition of equipment for a special project. So, yan ay under temporarily restricted. Kaya siya, contribution revenue, temporarily restricted to record donation received for the acquisition. Okay, next, yung na-receive na securities na 100,000. Yan ay permanent, under a permanent endowment. So, how do you recognize it? You debit securities, you credit contribution revenue, permanently restricted. Okay. The transaction on July 1. Yung non-profit organization, nagbayad daw siya ng 20,000 for the equipment. Then, naka-receive siya ng dividend income from the securities na 4,500. Itong 20,000 is related to the cash and yung 4,500 is related to the securities. So, nagbayad ng 20,000 for the equipment. Bakit siya nagbayad ng 20,000? Kasi nga, yung na-receive niya na cash na ito on June 1 ay gagamitin pang bili ng equipment. So, how do you recognize it? You credit cash, 20,000, and then you debit the account title net assets released from restrictions. Sir, bakit net assets released from restrictions? Because tinransfer mo na yan from temporary restriction to unrestricted fund. So you take a look at the unrestricted fund on July 1. You debit to record the purchase of funds. And then, to record the transfer of temporarily restricted fund. Diba? To record the transfer. Etong debit net assets released from restrictions and then credit cash 20,000 ang kabanggang entry niyan under the unrestricted fund is yung pagkaka-receive niya. You debit cash 20,000 natanggap niya and then credit net assets released from restrictions. So ito na yun, 20,000. Then, nung na-receive niya yan, ginamit niya yun to buy the item. You debit property and equipment and then credit cash to record the purchase of equipment. Next, the receipt of the dividend income from the securities na 4,500. So how do you recognize it? Under the unrestricted fund, you debit cash for 5 and investment income for 5. Bakit doon siya nakasama? Because ang sabi under the provision on securities, any income earned on the securities is restricted to use for the special project. Kaya nandun pa rin siya sa restricted fund. So, ito yun. Okay, so other funds of the non-profit organizations, the endowment fund, we already have discussed this, yung endowment fund, agency, plant fund. Okay, let us take a look at how the revenues and gains from pooled investments work. I think I will be ending the discussions on this module 5.2. Let us have a next part because medyo mahaba yung discussion related to this. Kaya. I think, sige, tapusin na natin. Medyo konti na lang din naman pala. Okay. So how do we look at the revenues and gains from pooled investments? So many of the funds of the non-profit organizations have cash available for investments in securities and other money market instruments. To provide efficient management of the investment programs, the investments of a non-profit organization may be pooled to a single portfolio manager. The pooling technique will facilitate proper allocation of investment revenues and realized and unrealized gains and losses to each participating fund. So there are idle funds that can be invested into other productive pooled investments. So ito yung concept under the non-profit organizations. While we look at non-profit organizations as as not profit oriented, it is, however, a a must that we still efficiently manage our resources. Hindi naman porke non-profit organizations is hahayaan na lang natin na matulog yung funds on our bank accounts or on our vault. But we still efficiently manage our resources. But yung sinasabing not for profit is yung the primary purpose or the establishment of of the organization is not really for profit, but yung efficient management ng resources na meron ka, it is still a must for non-profit organizations to handle their finances well. Kaya merong tinatawag na revenues and gains from pooled investments. So let us take a look. To illustrate the pooling of investments, assume that on January 2, the two funds of PPG Foundation, a non-profit organization, pooled their investments to be managed by the unrestricted fund as follows. So the unrestricted fund is 60,000 at cost, at fair market value at 54,000. The restricted fund is 40 and at cost and at fair value 66,000. So merong original equity na tinatawag yung 45 and 55%. So saan nakuha yon? This is based on the current fair market value na given yung 54 na nandyan. Okay, let us take a look at the example. So, yan yung original data on our unrestricted and restricted fund. So, let us take a look at this. For example, if 10,000 net realized gains of the investment pool during 2011 were reinvested, net unrealized gains amounted to 5,000, and interest and dividend income of 7 was distributed during 2011. These amounts are allocated as shown below. So, kung saan i-allocate yung mga gains and incomes revenue kapag pinagsama natin yung mga idle funds from unrestricted and restricted funds. So let us take a look. We always refer out our original equity ratio and proportion. So for unrestricted fund 45%, for restricted fund 55%. So sa sample, meron tayong 10,000 net realized gains and meron tayong 5,000 net unrealized gains. So how do we recognize it? How do we separate or distribute it under the unrestricted and restricted funds. So we use our original equity percentages. So 15,000 times 45% is your distribution for unrestricted fund na 6,750. The rest kay restricted fund. Same is true with the interest and dividends income. Magkano ba yung interest and dividends income? 7,000. So 7,000 times the original equity percentages na 45% is 3,150. The rest kay restricted fund. Okay. Each of the funds participating in the investment pool debits investments and credits gains on investment. So how do they recognize? Debit investment, credit gain on investment, or investment income. Kung magkano yung kanyang share doon. Okay. Next. Let us take a look at this passage. If another fund of PPG Foundation entered the investment pool on December 31, halimbawa, ibang fund, ang meron pang ibang classifications ng fund na nandyan, pwedeng i-revise natin yung original equity percentages based on December 31. Current fair market values of the investment portfolio. Okay. The revised equity percentages are maintained until the membership of the investment pool changes again. So kung walang changes, kung unrestricted and restricted fund lang ang pinagkukuhanan ng mga investments, ay yun lang ang gagamitin natin na original equity percentages. Okay, the financial statements of non-profit organizations, I attach a sample of the financial statements used under the non-profit organizations. This will be for your reference when you are answering some, maybe some problems in the future. Let's take a look at the statement of activities, which is the income statement for non-profit organizations. Revenues and gains, the expenses. So you have to be familiar at how it is organized. So inunaw yung revenues and gains and then expenses. Then under revenues and gains, andyan yung contributions, fees, investment income, yung mga net realized and unrealized gains on investments and other revenues. So ito yung total unrestricted revenues and gains. Pag pinagsama-sama yun. The net assets released from restrictions, 6,000. So these are the total unrestricted revenues, gains, and other support. Okay. Then the expenses related to that, programs, operating expenses, fundraising. Okay. So increase in unrestricted net assets. Take note of how it is recognized. Increase in unrestricted net assets ang tawag. Changes naman in temporarily restricted net assets, changes in permanently restricted net assets. So, ganun ang concept natin. So, I think this will be for your study. Yung samples ng financial statements under the non-profit organizations. Okay, statement of financial position. So what is the difference between the two, between a normal business enterprise and the non-profit when it comes to the statement of financial position is yung paggamit natin ng net assets. The net assets is your assets minus liabilities, hindi ba? Essentially, these are your equity accounts. Pero under the non-profit organizations, we use the net assets terminology classified into unrestricted, temporarily restricted, and permanently restricted assets. Kaya nga tinototal yung total liability. We sum up the total liabilities and the net assets, 147,450, which is equal to your total assets. So the use of the terminologies, we do not use equity under the non-profit organizations. Okay, the cash flows. So I think that ends the discussion. The latter part, the is just an illustration of how the items are presented in uh, the financial statements when you are a non-profit organization. The voluntary health and welfare organizations are essentially the same with the same concept as that of a hospital. Uh, the concepts we have identified in the nonprofit organizations will be used in analyzing the transactions under uh, transactions under a non-profit organization. So yung there are several non-profit organizations na hindi natin na-mention because we focus on schools, universities, and then hospitals. But essentially, yung halimbawa, yung mga social and country clubs, mga labor unions, the logic on the preparation of the financial statements, on the recording are essentially the same. We cannot hindi na kasi natin kayang isa-isahin yung yung uniqueness of each item, but in the board exam, the most dominant ones are the school, the hospitals. Uh, Once you knew the concept of the restricted funds, temporarily restricted funds, permanent restricted funds, the endowment funds, the recognition of patient service revenue, the contribution revenue, and among other items, madali mo nang maiintindihan how the non-profit organizations, the other non-profit organizations work. So I think that ends the discussion on nonprofit organizations. For the next uh, exercises, we will be looking at how we integrate government accounting and nonprofit organizations in comparison to each other as we progress with the discussion on the course accounting for government and nonprofit organizations. So I think that ends the discussion for module 5.2. Thank you and keep safe.